Okay, so I'm going to actually show you how to put the binding on, how to fold it, how to go around the inside curve. And then I'm going to show you an extra little tip that we do where we actually, when you look at our bindings, we actually sew this shut. And it's not hand stitched, it's actually sewn with the machine. And so we get a perfect little 45-degree seam right in between on each one of our little corners here. And I know it's going to be really hard for you guys to see, but I'm going to show you how I do that. So first of all, what we want to do is when you're working with any type of a curve binding, a scalloped edge quilt, you don't want to go through and just sew a whole bunch of strips together. Excuse me for a minute. What you want to do is sew a couple of them and make sure that where your seams are falling, that they do not fall. I need some water. That they don't fall in the middle right there on this corner, that inside corner. So what I do is I'll just sew one and then I'll add the other one as soon as I know where that's going to fall. And this one's actually going to fall right here where I want it to, so that's great. So we just have a 45-degree angle and we're going to sew that with our machine. And there's no difference there than what you would do for any type of a binding. So, and then I'm just going to finger press that seam open. Now, when I'm doing a straight binding, I normally don't worry about finger pressing that, but when I'm doing something on a curve, I like to open that binding up because it reduces the bulk going around a curved seam. Okay, so the other thing is I want to show you is this pad, what I did is when I got done with the quilting on this, I came in and I sewed a 1/4-inch seam allowance. And if you have a quilting machine, you can actually do that before you take it off your frame. And it's just a 1/4 inch in from the edge. The other thing I need to show you, and I need to grab a purple thing or so that I can show you what I'm pointing at here. Right here on the end of your purple thing, it's actually a 1/4 inch. And when you look at that, that little square on the purple thing fits right into a little square on your where that corner is. And we have to come in here and we're going to stitch down to this end right here. And then when we get to this point, then we have to turn our piece and we're going to start going the other direction with it, right? Before we do that, we want to take a pair of scissors, and they need to be pretty strong, sharp scissors, and we're going to clip, and I'm going to clip this down almost to the inside of where I showed you that little square was. And because I did the basting stitch, I can see exactly how far I need to clip. So see, I've clipped a V into that spot right there. All right. Now I'm going to take this to my machine and I'm going to use my glue and glue this just because I think it'll be easier for you guys to see what I'm doing. So I'm just going to run my glue right around the outside edge here. And then we're going to take this bias binding. Now the bias strips are actually cut 1 3/8 inches. And it's a single binding. When I used to do it, when I first started doing this technique, I did a double folded binding. But when I get into curves, I just have found that I really like the single binding better than being folded in half. So once I get this glued down, I can see where that stitch line comes in at a 1/4 inch. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pin and place that into the binding, and then I'm going to sew right to that point before I pivot to go around the other direction. Okay, so we're going to put this up here at my machine. And I wanted to use a regular stitch. I don't want my tight stitch, so I'm going to go back up to a 2.2, which is what my machine comes on. And then we're going to start sewing 1/4 of an inch. And notice I'm not using any type of a walking foot because I'm working with a curved seam, and a walking foot, they're so wide and they don't turn around on a curved seam. So you want to just use a regular foot, and the smaller your foot, the better, the easier it is to sew it.
Judy, I noticed that when I'm going to be funny here. So when I was off talking, you got that piece all tilted. So, I'm kidding. But one of the things that I'm noticing here is, do you recommend that everybody then trim their piece with a 1/4 inch seam, like, so they use it as a guide?
You mean when they're all done with their quilting?
Right.
Well, when they're quilting it, they've already, before they put it on the frame, the paper, it's already been trimmed down to the exact size it's supposed to be. And so then they just sew that stitch line around. So you're not really doing any more trimming on it.
Okay, but that's a 1/4 inch, and is it just kind of being used
Yes,
as a
I'm
guide?
sewing exactly 1/4 of an inch.
Right. Okay.
Okay, right around the curved edge is exactly 1/4 of an inch.
Right.
Okay, so I've stopped and I'm right where I put that pin, and so now I need to pivot. So I'm going to lift my pressure foot up, and I'm going to pull that pin out, and then I'm going to just take my flower here, and I'm going to start folding it until that binding is basically straight in front of me. So can you kind of see how I've got that? So now I basically, it's just a straight binding now. I've folded this underneath. And when you do that fold, you want to make sure that the part that you're sewing is the part that's next to the machine. So I'm going to sew onto this piece, and the folded part's going to be on top of that. And once I get that folded to where my binding's straight, I'm going to actually take a couple stitches right at that point and go really slow, and I'm even going to tighten up my stitch just a little bit, and then I'm going to go back up to my normal stitch, and we're going to start sewing again. And I'm going to sew up about halfway around that curve, and then I'm going to stop. And I'm going to show you how you would fold this. So first of all, I'm going to show you the way that most people would do this. So we have this where we cut this part, then we're going to come in and we're going to get that piece in there, and we're going to clip that. And then I take my fabric and I would roll it around, and I would hand stitch it just like that. And normally what happens is it just naturally kind of folds in and tucks in underneath into a corner, inside corner. All right. If you're going to put this in a show, when they start looking for things to criticize you for, because normally when we put something in a show, we're asking somebody to judge it and tell us whether or not we did a good job, and then we get upset because they told us we didn't do a good job. So I always laugh, because if you don't want their opinion, don't put it in to be judged. So, but one of the things they do is they look to see whether or not you've hand stitched that down on an inside curve whenever you're working with any type of a scalloped edge. So I refuse to go in and hand stitch each of those down, and I've figured out a way that you can actually do that without hand stitching. So I'm going to go back to my very first ones here, and so I'm going to do this again. So I'm going to take this and fold the binding, this folded down flat inside between the two pieces, and I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to clip that. So now I've clipped in my binding and my other. So now I have kind of a V in there. And I kind of missed it a little bit, so I'm going to come back and clean it up just a little bit in there and get that excess fabric out of the V. Okay. I'm going to double check and see where I clip to and make sure that it goes right down to the V, which I was off just a little bit on it. So now I've got it to the V. Now I'm going to fold my flower, and I'm going to bring the binding up with it so that it actually looks like this. And we do have video out there that shows this technique. So now I have my quilt is folded straight along here. I've got my curves matched up, and my binding is pulled out and looks like this. Now we're going to take, and I'm going to use a pin here just so you can see. And so I'm going to show you this little tool. This is a plastic tool, and it's basically got a V cut out of it. Can you guys see what I'm talking about? There's just a little V cut out of there, and I'm going to use that to mark it. So I'm going to take this down here, and I'm going to slip it right under the edge of that binding, and I'm going to mark a little. Basically, I'm doing an inside 90-degree corner mark in there. So now when I have this, it looks like a little goose. I call it a gooseneck seam. And but basically it's just a 90-degree corner. Now I'm going to come in and I'm going to stitch that. And what I have to do is grab a little piece of paper, and I'm going to tear one off of this. And I'm going to start sewing on my paper. And I'm going to downsize my stitch to about 1.5. Now I haven't changed my thread. I'm just going to leave my light thread. But I'm going to tell you that you should always match the thread to your binding when you're doing this, because you're going to see the stitches when I turn it inside the way it's supposed to be done. So I'll probably pick it out and resew it with red thread when I'm done. But for now, I'm going to use what I have. Now I'm going to take this and put this under my machine pressure foot here, and I'm going to start stitching on that. With the paper, I can keep stitching. I'm going to stitch right up the fold of my fabric, and I'm going to sew on that line that I marked. And when I get to the corner, I'm going to stop, and then we're going to pivot. I need to go another stitch, it looks like. Just a little bit further. One more stitch. And now we're going to turn it. And then I sew the other direction around my 90-degree corner. Now when you look at the back, I'm going to mark it so you can see what I did here with this pencil. So I actually sewed just like that, and you can see where my stitches are. And now I'm going to pull that paper off, and I have a 90-degree corner sewn in there. I'm going to clip those. Then we flip it over, and we're going to fold our binding down. We're going to fold it halfway, and we're going to fold until we hit where the end of that stitch is, and that's going to be stitched down. And I'm just going to put some glue on it.
That's amazing. I have my nose pressed to the screen right now, Judy. That is amazing.
Yeah, this is one that you have to practice at, but if you're looking to do a perfect binding, this is a really cool technique.
Yeah, that is amazing. So you've been dipped out of one too many blue ribbons. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. So now when I look at it from this side, I actually have, it's sewn as a 90-degree corner, It's just sewing right around there, and there's no having to go back and do hand stitching.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
we just do that on all of it. Now, it takes time to do that on a queen size double wedding ring quilt. It'll take me a couple hours to get all of those little V's sewn in there. And I used to tell myself I would never do that. That's just a lot of waste of time. But I've become a little anal about it. Now I have to do it. So, because it does look really nice. So,
amazing.
I want to thank you guys for watching, and you can tune in probably sometime next week. Judel should have the video out that shows the paper piecing technique for doing the little flowers. All right, and I want to say thank you for joining us again. And
thank you for coming on. We love that you come on. So thank you so much.